It was supposed to be a routine day. Donald Trump, ever the businessman, ever the celebrity, stood near the gate at LaGuardia Airport, waiting for his flight to board. The hustle and bustle of travelers moving through the terminal created a familiar hum of activity. But today, the air felt different. Heavy, almost as if everyone was holding their breath, unaware that something was about to break the stillness. Trump glanced at the flight details on his phone, mentally reviewing his plans for the coming week. His eyes lingered on the screen for a moment, thoughts racing, when a voice suddenly sliced through the air. "Excuse me, sir. Your ticket, please." The voice belonged to a gate agent. Her name tag read Tasha. She stood with her hand extended, a polite but firm expression on her face. Trump, accustomed to the occasional interaction with airline staff, offered his ticket without hesitation, expecting the usual pleasantries. But Tasha didn't immediately scan the barcode. Instead, she looked at him with a steady gaze. There was something in her eyes, a coldness, perhaps even a flicker of disdain, that sent a subtle chill down his spine. "I'm sorry, sir, but it looks like your seat is in the wrong section," she said, glancing up from the ticket, then back to her screen. Trump raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about? I'm in first class like always." Her lips twitched, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, you're right, Mr. Trump. But it's not about where you sit. It's about who you are. It's about the kind of privilege you carry. You've been flying in luxury all your life, haven't you?" Trump blinked, momentarily confused. "Excuse me?" Tasha's voice dropped a notch, the words sharp and biting. "You're too privileged to even understand what it's like for people like me. People who work every day, people who have to scrape by, people who don't get special treatment just because they have money. You think you're above all of us, don't you? Your wealth, your status. They've always kept you safe from the real world." A collective silence seemed to fall over the lounge, and all eyes shifted toward them. Trump's face flushed with disbelief. The anger surged through him, quick and hot, but he bit his lip. The words she had just thrown at him, words laced with venom, lingered in the air, suffocating the space between them. Tasha's gaze never wavered. "You're just like the rest of them, like all the others who've never had to fight for anything, who've never been judged just because of the color of their skin or the neighborhood they come from." The words hit harder than anything Trump had faced before. It was a slap, not just to his ego, but to his sense of reality. No one had ever spoken to him like this, especially not in public, with so many watching. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Trump asked, his voice low, but laced with an edge of warning. But Tasha wasn't intimidated. She shook her head slowly, as if she'd heard his kind of question 1,000 times before. "Yeah, I know exactly who you are. A man who thinks his money makes him untouchable. A man who probably doesn't even see the people around him, just the people who serve him. You think you're different from the rest of us, but you're not. You're just part of the system that keeps people like me down." The words stung, sharper than a blade. Trump's mind raced, his thoughts colliding with the reality of what was happening. He was a public figure, a symbol of wealth and power. But this was different. This wasn't a political jab or a media hit. This was personal. This was a racial accusation, one that cut to the very core of who he was and who he had always been. The room had gone deathly quiet. Every eye was on them now. People shifted nervously in their seats, unsure whether to intervene, to speak out, or to stay silent. The tension was unbearable, thick enough to cut through the most hardened of souls. And yet, Trump stood there, frozen for a moment, his mouth dry. What could he say to something so loaded, so full of unspoken history? He had always been the one in control of every conversation, every situation. But now, for the first time in a long time, he felt powerless. "I don't think you understand," Trump said, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to regain his composure. "You don't know anything about me." Tasha's eyes narrowed, but her voice didn't rise. Instead, it became even more resolute. "I know enough. More than you think." There was no going back now. The confrontation had escalated, and as the seconds ticked by, the world around them seemed to stand still. Trump's next move would define everything that followed. Would he lash out in anger, Strike back with all the fire that had built up inside him over the years? Or would he find a way to break free from this unexpected clash, this collision of worlds? He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence between them was suffocating, a wall of judgment and resentment rising higher with every breath. And in that moment, as the crowd waited, unsure of what would happen next, the story of what had just unfolded at that airport terminal began to take on a life of its own. The consequences of this exchange would ripple far beyond these walls. The battle between power and oppression had just been set in motion. The air in the airport lounge was still charged with tension. No one dared speak, as the silence hung thick. Inside Donald Trump's mind, a storm was raging. Tasha stood before him, her eyes burning with resentment. Her words still echoed in his ears. "You think you're above all of us," she had said. For the first time in a long while, Trump felt a sharp, unfamiliar sting. As the seconds ticked by, he tried to form a response. He couldn't help but think about what had led them to this point. It wasn't just the words that hurt. It was the story behind them. The anger, the bitterness, the accusations. Where did they come from? What was the truth beneath the venom? Tasha's life had never been easy. Growing up on the south side of Chicago, she saw harsh realities. Racial lines were drawn in every aspect of daily life. As a young girl, she watched her parents struggle to provide. Her mother, a nurse working double shifts, always encouraged her. "Hold your head high. Be proud of who you are," her mother said. Despite her efforts, Tasha felt judged by the world. Her father, quiet but proud, had a more cynical view. "The system's not made for us," he would say. "It's a game, Tasha, and we're not even in the race." Those words stuck with her as she grew older. She worked hard, pushing through high school and college. She knew her opportunities would always be limited. She had to be twice as good, work twice as hard, to be seen as capable. She watched others treated differently, subtly or openly. The whispers and double standards became part of her reality. People clutched their bags tighter as she walked by. Day-to-day microaggressions built up over the years. In the grocery store, at work, in everyday interactions, they were constant. By college graduation, she had perfected masking her pain. Behind her smile, bitterness brewed. She watched the world cater to the rich and powerful. She saw privilege allow others to thrive effortlessly. No matter her success, the world reminded her she was different. Standing before Trump, the floodgates opened. Years of resentment and pain poured out. This man represented everything that hurt her and others like her. He embodied the system she had battled her whole life. He stood smug and confident, while she had fought for every scrap. In her mind, it wasn't just about Trump. It was about the system allowing people like him to thrive. Meanwhile, people like her suffered in silence. Trump's life was one of privilege. He had never truly confronted systemic oppression. Born to Fred Trump, his path was paved with gold. Elite schools, wealth, and high society surrounded him. Trump's life was one of exceptionalism from the start. Doors opened for him because of his last name. He never had to struggle for a seat at the table. Prejudice and barriers were foreign to his world. The world catered to his needs effortlessly. This moment with Tasha was different. It was a personal confrontation with racial inequality. Before, protests and accusations felt distant. They never seemed to concern him directly. Trump saw himself as an outsider in wealthy circles. He prided himself on defying the status quo. His empire was built on self-reliance, or so he believed. This moment, however, challenged everything. Tasha's words carried emotional weight he hadn't felt before. For the first time, guilt and frustration consumed him. He realized how insulated he had been from others' pain. Tasha's accusations weren't about politics or business. They were about deeper, systemic realities. Trump's usual sharp comebacks felt inadequate. What could he say? Should he retaliate or try to understand? The tension was unbearable. Trump's wealth and fame couldn't shield him from this truth. Part of him wanted to deny it all. He worked hard to build his empire. After all, why should he bear the weight of centuries of oppression? Yet, Tasha's gaze didn't waver. Something inside Trump began to shift. His anger gave way to a harder truth. This wasn't just a clash between two people. It was a collision of worlds and histories. Trump now faced a decision. Would he respond with arrogance? Or would he listen, understand, and change? The silence stretched on. Trump's next words would decide everything. The air in the terminal felt heavier now. It was as if the world had shifted on its axis in the blink of an eye. For a moment, time seemed to stop as Trump and Tasha faced each other. But this wasn't just an argument between two individuals. It was something much deeper, much more ingrained in the fabric of society. Tasha's words had cut through more than just Trump's carefully constructed exterior. They had cracked open a larger wound, a wound that had been festering for centuries. The incident at the airport wasn't just about a confrontation between a businessman and an employee. It was a microcosm of a larger, systemic issue that spanned far beyond the airport walls. Tasha had grown up in a world that told her, time and time again, that her value was determined by her skin color. The stories of exclusion, of being denied opportunities, of being overlooked and dismissed because of racial biases weren't just anecdotes she had heard. They were part of the daily reality that shaped her worldview. Although she had fought to rise above the constraints imposed on her, she knew that the battle wasn't just personal. It was societal. It was systemic. As the gate agent at a major airline, Tasha had seen firsthand how institutional biases influenced the way customers and employees were treated. Airlines, like many other large institutions, had cultivated a culture of service that outwardly prided itself on professionalism and inclusivity. The posters on the walls, the diversity training, the constant messages of respect and equality all suggested that the airline was a place where race didn't matter. But the reality was different. Tasha had experienced it daily, in the way passengers spoke to her, in the way her colleagues treated her, and in the way her superiors turned a blind eye to microaggressions. It wasn't overt racism. It didn't come in the form of blatant insults or direct discrimination. Instead, it was more insidious. It was the unspoken biases that dictated who was promoted, who was given the best shifts, and who was assumed to be unprofessional. For Tasha, this behavior wasn't just something she could brush off. It was a reminder, every single day, of how the world operated. People who looked like her were often expected to be better, to work harder, and to smile more to compensate for the color of their skin. She had been trained to act twice as good as her white counterparts to be considered good enough. She couldn't help but see this in the context of everything that had led her to this point. This moment, standing in front of Trump, unleashed years of pent-up anger and frustration. But her actions weren't just a personal outburst. They were a cry for justice, a demand for recognition in a system that continuously marginalized her and others like her. Her anger wasn't just for the inconvenience caused by a powerful man. It was for the years of struggle and generations of people crushed beneath systemic inequality. The frustration she felt on that day had boiled over, but it was rooted in a lifetime of institutionalized racism. It wasn't just her battle, but the battle of countless others who had been silenced for far too long. Trump's reality was far removed from this. His life had been one of privilege, not just in terms of wealth, but in terms of access. Born into a wealthy family, he had never been asked to prove himself in the ways that Tasha had been. He had always been surrounded by the comforts of his status. He had never been forced to grapple with the weight of being a minority or judged based on something as superficial as skin color. Trump's success wasn't just due to his business acumen or his name. It was because he lived in a system that catered to people like him, wealthy, white, and powerful. Doors opened for him without question. Whether dealing with partners or the media, the system tended to favor his viewpoint, needs, and desires. It wasn't a conscious choice on the part of others. It was the way the system worked. In this confrontation, Trump wasn't just a businessman responding to a challenge from an employee. He was a symbol of a larger structure, an embodiment of the privileges afforded to those at the top. His response to Tasha would reverberate far beyond the walls of the airport. His actions would set an example of how those in power respond to challenges. As he stood there, stunned by Tasha's words, Trump realized this moment wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an invitation to confront something he had spent most of his life avoiding. Could he ignore the deeper issues at play? Could he dismiss the larger context that Tasha's anger spoke to? Or would he face the uncomfortable truth that the system he benefited from was flawed? His wealth and power weren't just symbols of success. They were products of a larger, deeply ingrained system of privilege. He had always operated within this system without questioning its fairness. To him, the rules were simple: succeed, rise, win. The idea that anyone could be held back by something as arbitrary as race was foreign to him. Tasha, and countless others like her, had always fought against a system that saw them as inferior. She wasn't allowed the same opportunities or chances to succeed. She navigated a maze of racial prejudice that followed her from childhood to her career. The microaggressions, systemic biases, and lack of representation shaped her reality. As much as she tried to rise above them, the system always held her down, creating barriers. This was the intersection of privilege and oppression. Trump's life of entitlement contrasted starkly with Tasha's life of struggle. It wasn't just a difference in wealth or status. It was a difference in how the world treated them. The airline also played a role in this broader issue. As a major corporation, it prided itself on being inclusive and progressive, but it perpetuated the same racial biases rampant in society. Its diversity training programs were just a performance. The real work of dismantling systemic racism wasn't fully addressed. Tasha was a product of her upbringing and an institution that failed to recognize subtle racism. The culture of the airline reinforced biases through interactions, promotions, and appearances. The company had policies on paper but lacked commitment to addressing disparities. As Tasha's anger hung in the air, Trump's internal struggle continued. His next move would reflect his beliefs and his place in the world. Would he fight back, reinforcing the status quo? Would he acknowledge the issues and use his power to change the conversation? The tension thickened as bystanders watched closely. Would Trump challenge the accusations or question the system? His response had the power to shift the narrative. The noise of the bustling terminal seemed to fade. Trump and Tasha stood facing each other. Their heated words hung in the air like a storm cloud. The confrontation was far from over. The consequences of what had just happened began to settle in. Each character grappled with the emotional fallout in their own way. The rawness of their emotions pulsed through the terminal. It set the stage for what would come next. Tasha stood frozen in the moments following her outburst. She felt a surge of pride when she spoke her mind. She called out inequities that had simmered beneath the surface for years. She released everything she had swallowed in silence in one heated moment. For a brief instant, she felt powerful. She believed she had finally taken control over something out of her hands. As the adrenaline began to wear off, her sense of empowerment faded. Her heart began to pound. A rush of regret flooded her thoughts, mixed with gnawing fear. She had spoken out in a way she hadn't in years. Her words had been sharp, pointed, and fierce. Now, the spotlight was on her. There were witnesses who had seen everything. Passengers and co-workers had heard it all. The implications of her defiance began to feel heavier. She wondered about the consequences of what she had done. Would she lose her job over this? Would the airline label her a troublemaker? Tasha had always walked the fine line between speaking her truth and keeping peace. Now, that line seemed blurred. The weight of her words settled heavily on her shoulders. She questioned if she was a hero or a fool. She stood up for herself, but feared she had gone too far. Her emotions mirrored the uncertainty of her future. She worried about how the world would see her. Would she be someone who fought back? Or would she be cast aside as someone who had lost control? On the other side of the confrontation, Trump seethed with fury. For someone used to wealth, power, and admiration, this was rare. Being publicly humiliated was a jarring experience for him. The shock of Tasha's words gave way to a deep, searing anger. Her accusations cut through his sense of self like a knife. Trump was used to being in control. He was someone who dictated the terms in every situation. He commanded attention and respect in boardrooms, media, and politics. Now, he felt small and exposed. Tasha had reduced him to something less than his powerful image. Her words challenged his status and identity. He had never seen himself as complicit in oppression, but her words sent waves of confusion through him. He questioned how his life had reached this point. His anger swelled as he replayed Tasha's words in his head. Her attack wasn't just a challenge to his success. It questioned the foundation of his achievements. Beneath his anger, he felt hurt. He hated feeling vulnerable and bruised. Trump stood gritting his teeth, trying to contain his emotions. For the first time, he wasn't sure what to do. The emotional tension between them couldn't have been more apparent. Tasha's voice, once loud and defiant, grew quiet. The weight of her regret pressed in on her. Her confident posture shifted to a defensive stance. She crossed her arms as if shielding herself from the storm she created. Trump's anger burned brightly, but beneath it was confusion and disbelief. He had never faced someone questioning the foundation of his success. Neither was willing to back down. Their exchange had become more than a confrontation. It was a battle of egos and a clash of worldviews. Tasha represented the overlooked and marginalized. Trump represented the powerful and privileged. The tension between them continued to build. Neither was willing to give up ground. Bystanders seemed frozen, unsure whether to intervene. Tasha's pride in standing up for herself gave way to anxiety. Her words, meant to challenge injustice, now felt dangerous. She worried about the consequences. Would this moment end her career? Even as doubts crept in, she felt a weight had been lifted. She had said what so many others feared to say. Even if consequences followed, she knew she had done the right thing. Trump's emotional fallout was just beginning. His anger was consuming, but Tasha's words struck a deeper chord. They challenged the system that had supported him. For the first time, he questioned his role in something larger. In that moment, the emotional tension peaked. Trump had to make a decision. Something had to give, and the confrontation was about to shift. The room was thick with tension. The seconds seemed to stretch on forever as the aftermath of the confrontation settled into a heavy silence. Passengers had scattered, but the few remaining bystanders were still frozen in place, unsure of how to react. Tasha stood, her arms crossed defensively, her mind racing, caught between fear and pride. Trump, on the other hand, was still seething, his face flushed with the remnants of anger, his fists clenched by his sides. Everyone expected the usual, more insults, more grandstanding. But what came next was something that no one could have predicted. Trump stood there for what felt like an eternity. His initial shock and rage had given way to a strange, unsettling stillness. In that silence, something began to shift. His thoughts, which had been a jumbled mess of anger, confusion, and hurt, started to clarify. He realized that this wasn't just a personal attack. It wasn't just about his pride being wounded. It was about something deeper, a truth that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. It was something he had always known but never truly confronted. The accusations leveled against him, about his privilege, his life of comfort, and the systemic structures that allowed him to thrive while others struggled, were not entirely wrong. He had lived a life of incredible privilege. He had never had to worry about how others saw him, how his race, his wealth, or his background affected his opportunities. He had never been on the receiving end of the kind of bias that Tasha had endured. While he had always justified his success as the result of hard work, the truth was, there were elements of his success that had come far more easily to him than they ever would to someone like Tasha. He wasn't a fool. He had seen the way the world worked, how people like him were treated differently, given the benefit of the doubt, allowed to rise to the top without the same barriers that others faced. Yet, in that moment, he felt as if his whole identity, his life's work, his accomplishments, the very foundation of his success, was being called into question. His pride had been wounded. Now, as the adrenaline from the confrontation began to ebb, something else emerged, a desire to confront the deeper issues at play. Trump wasn't a stranger to fighting back. This wasn't a fight he could win with anger alone. If he wanted to truly address what had just happened, he knew he had to do more than just lash out. He had to say something that would make people think. He needed to make them see the bigger picture. With a deep breath, Trump took a step forward, his voice steady but firm. For a moment, no one knew what to expect. His supporters, those who had gathered around earlier, were still watching closely. The airline management had been standing nearby, waiting for the moment when they would have to intervene. But instead of the typical angry response everyone was bracing for, Trump surprised them all. "I'm not going to stand here and pretend I didn't hear what you said," Trump began, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority. "What you said struck me, I'll admit. It stung. But as much as it may have hurt, I can't ignore the truth in your words. You're right about a lot of things. There was a collective intake of breath. The stunned silence in the room deepened. Trump, the man who had built his reputation on power, on toughness, on winning at all costs, was acknowledging her accusation. It was an unprecedented move, one that no one could have predicted. I've spent my life accumulating wealth, privilege, and status, he continued. I've benefited from systems that favor people like me, people with power, with influence, with connections. And I've never had to worry about being treated differently because of my race, my background, or my gender. The truth is, I've had opportunities that many will never get. I've walked through doors that were open to me simply because of who I am. That's not just a coincidence. That's the way the world works. Tasha stood frozen, her eyes locked on him. She had expected him to fight back, to tear into her, to dismiss her completely. But here he was, acknowledging the very reality she had spent years trying to get people to see. His words were not an attack. They were an admission, a rare and unexpected moment of vulnerability. Trump paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. The airline management exchanged nervous glances. They hadn't expected this, didn't know how to handle it. The passengers, who had witnessed the outburst earlier, were now hanging on every word. I don't want to pretend that I understand your struggles, Trump continued. I can't. I've never had to fight for a seat at the table. I've always had a place. But what I do know is that the systems that allowed me to get where I am are the same systems that make it harder for people like you to succeed. And that's not fair. It's not right. Tasha's heart raced, her mind spinning. She hadn't expected him to say any of this. She had assumed that his pride would prevent him from ever admitting such a thing. But here he was, not just acknowledging her struggles, but also admitting that the system was broken. This wasn't just a personal apology. It was a recognition of a larger truth. It was a truth that affected millions of people across the country and around the world. I know I've made mistakes, Trump said, his voice softening. I've said things I regret. I've treated people poorly. I've been part of a system that has hurt a lot of people. But I'm not going to pretend like I didn't benefit from it. I'm not going to stand here and act like I'm not part of the problem. The room was silent. The words hung in the air like a challenge. It was a statement that forced everyone to confront their own assumptions about power, privilege, and race. Trump wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was calling attention to something much bigger. In that moment, the entire dynamic in the room shifted. For Tasha, the emotional impact of Trump's words was profound. She had expected him to tear into her, to belittle her, to remind her of her place. But instead, he had done the opposite. He had not only acknowledged her struggle, but he had also admitted his role in perpetuating the systems that kept people like her down. She felt a strange mixture of disbelief and validation. She had spent years trying to be heard, trying to make people understand the challenges faced by those at the bottom of the social hierarchy. And now, for the first time, someone with real power was listening. Trump's admission, his acknowledgement of the systems that perpetuated inequality, was a powerful one. It was a moment that demanded attention. It was a moment that would ripple through the press, through public opinion, and through the future interactions between the two individuals. The room was heavy with anticipation. No one knew how to respond to what Trump had just said. It wasn't the angry rebuttal they had expected. It wasn't the attack on her character they had been bracing for. Instead, it was a call for change. The tension had shifted from a personal confrontation to a larger conversation about race, privilege, and social justice. Trump's shocking response had defied expectations. It had altered the course of his confrontation with Tasha. It had set the stage for a conversation that could no longer be ignored. In that brief, unexpected moment of truth, Trump had done something few would have ever predicted. He had stepped outside the boundaries of his own pride and privilege to confront the larger issues at play. Now, the world would be watching to see what came next. Would this bold statement spark a shift in the way he approached power? Would it challenge others to do the same? As the room slowly began to stir with quiet murmurs, it was clear that something had changed. The tension had been broken. In its place stood something far more powerful, the possibility of transformation. The dust had barely settled from the confrontation when the story exploded into the public eye. Trump's unexpected admission of his privilege sent shockwaves through the media. It was the kind of statement that couldn't be ignored. The aftermath unfolded in ways that no one could have predicted. This single moment had sparked a national conversation that was far from over. The media coverage was immediate, with headlines blaring Trump's unexpected words. News outlets, both liberal and conservative, rushed to cover the story. In many ways, Trump had played right into the media's insatiable hunger for a scandal. But this time, the scandal wasn't about insults or anger. It was about something much deeper that few were prepared to address. His acknowledgement of privilege left the public reeling. People who had always dismissed the idea of systemic racism were now being forced to confront it. The more conservative outlets were quick to criticize him. They accused him of abandoning his base and giving in to a left-wing narrative. Some argued that Trump had betrayed the values that had made him successful. Others saw his words as a bold step forward. They viewed it as an admission of uncomfortable truths long ignored in American discourse. Progressive outlets and activists praised him for his rare self-awareness. They hailed his statement as a breakthrough and a moment of personal growth. However, there were skeptics who questioned his sincerity. Was this a shift in his beliefs or a public relations move? Could one admission erase years of divisive rhetoric and policies? Debates raged on social media, in newsrooms, and in living rooms. People were forced to examine their beliefs and biases. The public faced the uncomfortable truth that race and power are deeply intertwined in society. Meanwhile, the airline involved in the incident came under scrutiny. The company had been slow to act and had not released an official statement. Critics argued the airline was complicit in perpetuating systemic issues. Others believed the airline had no obligation to get involved. This perspective was quickly losing support. Activists demanded a full investigation into the employees' actions. They called for the company to address racial bias within its ranks. The airline announced it would review its policies and procedures. They promised to train employees to recognize and confront racial bias. Some saw this as a positive step forward. Others questioned whether the actions were merely performative. The employee at the center of the controversy became a polarizing figure. Some defended her actions as a stand against injustice. Others saw her comments as a personal attack. The polarized debate reflected the broader divide in the country. The employee's fate hung in the balance. The airline eventually suspended her pending further investigation. The controversy highlighted the difficulty of navigating issues of race and privilege. Trump found himself reflecting on the impact of his words. For the first time, he reckoned with the complexities of race and privilege. His statement was a rare moment of vulnerability. He realized that acknowledgement alone was not enough. Trump began to consider how he could make a tangible difference. Could he use his platform to push for policies addressing racial inequality? Could he lend his influence to dismantling systemic barriers? He understood that change required putting his privilege on the line. The national conversation on race had shifted. People were more willing to discuss privilege, power, and systemic inequality. The path toward resolution remained unclear. Many still refused to acknowledge the depth of the problem. The conversation often felt hollow for those who had endured injustice, but there was a glimmer of hope. The dialogue sparked by Trump's words was not easily silenced. People were talking and listening. In a divided country, that was no small achievement. The situation offered no easy answers or solutions. But the dialogue marked the beginning of something larger. It was an imperfect and slow resolution. Yet, it held the possibility for lasting change.